Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Hibiscus Motorsports. In this video today, as you read from the title, we're going to be doing another Let's Talk. Today we're going to be talking about oil coolers. I know they're kind of a bit of a niche topic. They're very much overlooked in the automotive world, especially if your car is not a performance-built machine. If it's more like a street car, something like that. So today we're going to be talking about different types of oil coolers, the pros and cons of them, why might you want one, why might you not want one, and just overall going over exactly what they are and what they do. So stay tuned. Alrighty, so first things first, what is an actual oil cooler? An oil cooler is simply a radiator-style device. Usually the two main types of oil coolers are air-to-oil oil coolers that use airflow to cool down the oil, or water-to-oil oil coolers, which usually use an actual water from either a separate radiator or that tap from your actual OEM car's cooling system to cool down your oil. But again, it's just a radiator-style device to cool down oil. So here we have an actual oil cooler. This specific one is a row and fin style air-to-oil oil cooler. So these each individual little row has little fins in it. Oil will feed in from one of these fittings, go through, air will pass through the actual cooler, cooling down the oil, and then it will flow out the other side. Now, I personally don't own a water-to-oil style oil cooler, but effectively it's going to look kind of like a metal box that just has a inlet and outlet for the actual water and an inlet and outlet for the oil. Same thing, it's going to be different types of hoses or tubes that run near each other. One has the hot oil, one has the cold water, and we'll cool it down that way. Most setups you'll see will have a air-to-oil oil cooler, as they are a little bit simpler. It's an easier system to design and work with, but that is another type of oil cooler in the world. They're just not as common. Alrighty, so why might you want to consider putting an oil cooler in your car? So most cars from factory do not come with oil coolers. Some larger trucks or things like that, or some high-performance cars will come from factory with oil coolers. Things like the Mazda RX-7 and RX-8s came with oil coolers. As rotary engines, you want to keep those things very cool. The oil gets very hot inside of those cars, so they kind of need them, or otherwise it'll cause damage to the engine. So most, of your basic commuter sedans, things like that, don't have them, as the oil never really gets hot enough to warrant or need an oil cooler. So you might look at putting in an oil cooler if you are doing high performance driving or, racing or forced induction. Now, a lot of people will turbocharge Miatas, for example, and won't even think about their oil. Now, when you add a turbo to your system, oil gets a lot hotter, as most of the times that oil will also then feed into your turbo, as your turbo needs oil, unless you get one of those special grease style ones. But most turbos on cars are going to be ones that have a oil and water inlet, and that's just pulling oil from the sump. So that's also heating up the oil a lot, and if you put all that extra heat on the oil and all that extra stress with no oil cooler, it's going to get way too hot and not do its job effectively. Alrighty, so now as I just was talking about the actual heat, what do I mean by that? So if you don't know, obviously your oil, all fluids in your car, has a operating range for temperature. Now on a Miata, for example, most Miatas will be running between 160 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. That number can change based on things like turbochargers, superchargers, anything like that, a built engine. But for a stock Miata, most of the time I see from stock Miatas, I mostly see between like 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So when your oil begins to get over that, let's say 210, 220, it's definitely starting to get very hot. 240, 250, all that, it's way too hot. If you don't know, oil thins out. Now, we're not going to be talking, the whole science of weights and viscosity of oil, all that in this video, as this video is dedicated to oil coolers, not the oil itself. But this is a quick little thing. If oil is too hot, it can't effectively do its job. It's too thin, it can't lubricate properly, and that will start to create metal on metal, thus creating extra wear and potentially blowing up your engine. Alrighty, so why might you want to put an oil cooler on your car? What are some of the advantages? So obviously, first things first is it keeps your oil cool. Now, you don't necessarily want to put an oil cooler on a completely bone stock car that you daily drive. I'll explain that in the disadvantage side of everything, but if you're taking your car, drifting, off-roading, track racing, things like that, oil coolers are almost a necessity if you're really starting to push in your car. It's not just something, you take to the track and drive a little hard. If this is like a true dedicated race car or off-roading rig, a lot of times oil coolers are necessary for stuff like that. as it really helps keep the temperatures down, and that also includes keeping coolant temperatures down. So if your oil is cooler, it will kind of help cool everything else down around it, and oil passages and coolant passages in engines usually run pretty close to each other. Not all the time, but most of the time they run kind of close, and it just kind of helps cool the block down a little bit. Doesn't let it begin to build up with heat soak and all that, so definitely a huge advantage with temperature management. Also, it allows you to stay out on track longer, or let your car idle longer on the trails if you have a fan on your oil cooler, things like that. So definitely a huge advantage. All right, so now we're going to talk about some disadvantages. Obviously, the advantage list is very short, as really the whole point of an oil cooler is to just cool down oil. They don't do a lot more than that. Now, there are some disadvantages to go along with them. First thing being the added complexity. Now, on an oil cooler, as we can see from the one I showed before, this is the old oil cooler off my car. You can see that we have the main 26-row cooler, the lines, all that. This is just added complexity to your oiling system. Having all of that means you need to have more oil for the actual cooler, whether it be that you pre-fill it or you will fill the car up with the normal amount of oil, maybe a little bit more, start it up, let the oil start flowing, then constantly check the dipstick, then fill it up enough so that the cooler's full while the engine still maintains its full amount of oil. As if you fill up just the engine with how much oil it normally takes, you'll be running low once the actual cooler starts to fill up. So a little bit of added complexities. You got to watch out for leaks, things like that. Obviously, if this is a daily driver, you don't really want to have to worry about that. If your car is an OEM oil cooler, the factory, they thought of everything. You don't really have to worry about that. But installing an aftermarket one, especially if it's not a pre-built kit, if you DIY it yourself, it's definitely going to be more difficult to deal with. Most oil coolers won't leak unless you kind of go with like the junky, generic, no-name ones. But overall, they do add a little bit of complexity, so you do have to watch out for that. So now another disadvantage, if you saw in the last clip, I'll hold it back up again, this oil cooler has some white duct tape on it. Now, if you don't know why it has that, is if you have an oil cooler, let's just fell, like this one, you can experience overcooling. Now, that's why I was saying that you might not want to throw this on just, your stock naturally aspirated daily driver, as overcooling is a real possibility. This was on my basically stock horsepower, just an intake and catback exhaust on my Miata. That's the only power mods I have done to it. A 26-row oil cooler is too big for what kind of track driving I was doing. It's too big. It was overcooling the oil, so the oil wasn't getting up to actual operating temperature. Now, I know earlier in this video I said that when oil gets too hot, it doesn't do its job effectively. That also means when oil is too cold, it doesn't do its job effectively. It's too thick. It can't actually travel at the speed it needs to. Sometimes it can create too much oil pressure that can lead to certain things like gaskets blowing out. And thick oil doesn't actually lubricate parts as well as oil at the right temperature does. So the reason why there's tape on that is to block off some of the actual rows. And by doing that will effectively shorten down how much of the cooler is being used. However, it's just added difficulties and stress in the oiling system, as the cooler was too big, so the oil's still flowing through the parts that are taped off. They're just not getting air on them, so it's really not the best idea. So if you're going to do an oil cooler, definitely do one that is the proper size. There's really no charts. You just kind of have to base off of what kind of driving you're doing, what the temperature around you gets like in the summer, winter, all that. As oil coolers in the winter definitely can cause some issues. We'll talk about that in a little bit with thermostat, oil coolers, things like that. But definitely, they can cause overcooling, which is not good. Now, to piggyback off of the overcooling issue, is a lot of times people like to run a oil temperature and pressure gauge when they install an oil cooler. That's what I personally did. Right when I installed my oil cooler, I put a actual oil temperature and pressure gauge on my car. Now, the reason why is that, as I just said, with overcooling issues, if you have the potential of overcooling, if you can't see what your oil temperature is, you're going to have a bad time. You might be overheating still or overcooling it. You're really not going to know either way. Maybe the car will sound a little bit different if it's overcooled or overheated. When my Miata was starting to overcool, when my gauge originally, I didn't have it wired in for the first couple times I drove the car with it, and it was overcooling it slightly. It didn't sound different really at all. Found out that it was, taped it off, it started working fine. But just another kind of little disadvantage is, in my opinion, I recommend running a temperature gauge. Now, a lot of cars I know will come with oil temperature gauges from factory and oil pressure gauges. A lot of times those are dummy gauges, though. It's just better to get just a standalone gauge that reads the exact temperature, whether, even a degree and change, it'll read all that. Same thing with pressure. Adding an oil cooler will drop pressure in your system. Another disadvantage, I know there's a lot of disadvantages with oil coolers, but if you're in a racing application, I promise they're worth it. We'll talk about all that in the summary at the end. But so you just have to worry about the actual pressure drop, as well as, again, with the lines and all that, it's added complexity. So that's just something to look out for. So now let's go up to the Miata and take a look at my new oil cooler setup I have on the car and explain some, do's and don'ts for setting up your own oil cooler system. Alrighty, so here we are at the front of the Miata. Obviously, no front bumper right now. But right there, you can see, is my oil cooler. Now, I'm going to pop the hood so we can see it a little bit better. It is a little bit difficult to see right now, just mainly because the main bumper is still in the way. But if we get down a little bit lower, you can see the rest of it right down here and up into there. Now, mine is bolted to the frame of the car, so it's nice and solid, with a bolt that runs to the side of the radiator support. And then up top, just another bolt that bolts to the frame. If you're going to set up an oil cooler in your car, if you're going to DIY it, I highly recommend secure this thing well, as if it breaks, it's going to get oil everywhere. So another slight disadvantage of oil coolers is you got to be careful of them. If it breaks, gets cracked, anything like that, a line gets punctured, you're going to be leaking oil, and that oil is going to start pulling oil from your reserves and your sump, so be careful of it. So now, basically, the best way to set up an oil cooler for a car like this is make sure it has good airflow, make sure it's not going to be near something that's going to get crazy hot or anything like that. If it is in a place where it's more tucked away, make sure it has good ducting and get airflow, as if an oil cooler is not getting air, it's not going to do its job. And then the other thing I'm going to talk about is the length of the lines. Now, my first oil cooler setup, I got a secondhand oil cooler with the lines. It was set up for a FC RX-7. That's the second generation RX-7, if you don't know. Those lines were way too long, and I had them running really, really crazy, really dumb. The oil cooler was kind of thrown in front of the radiator just to get it to work, as I had a track day coming up within like a couple weeks of that, and I really wanted an oil cooler, as I was definitely overheating my oil on the track. So those lines were way too long, obviously. Lines being too long, again, just adds extra stress on the system, has to create it drops even more oil pressure, which isn't good, and just doesn't look good, doesn't really help with the cooling, just very inefficient. The oil has to get around a lot of loops and bends. So I'm going to show you how the lines are run on my Miata right now, and we'll talk about why this is a much better way to do it. Alright, so it's a little hard to see, but on a Miata, right up there by that little gold piece with the red, that is the sandwich plate where my oil feeds from the engine into the cooler. So if we can see, I just have the two lines running down over my manual steering rack, up over, then one mounts right up to the cooler right here, and then one just does a bend up, and then into a 90-degree bend around the other side. Two right there, as we can see. The lines are just as long as they need to be, they're not any longer. And that is the main thing when it comes to doing an oil cooler system, is you don't want the lines to have so much excess to them that they're just becoming inefficient, you're losing more pressure, all that. So keep the lines, again, as short as they possibly can be. It'll help you a lot. I know in this video I've done a lot of bashing on oil coolers, but in my personal opinion, if you're going to track your car, I think that should be one of the first modifications you do, as going from not having an oil cooler to now having an oil cooler, it's made a night and day difference on the track. The actual temperatures, all that, stay really nice and cool. Everything stays within operating temps, so definitely worth it if you're going to be tracking your car. Alrighty, so now I talked about a sandwich plate in the last clip. Now, obviously, what is that? So, a sandwich plate is a piece of metal that goes onto where your OEM oil cooler sits, or if you have a oil cooler, relocation plug or things like that, it's going to usually go either where your filter is or where your filter OEM was, depending on if you moved it, things like that. So effectively, it's just a little plate of metal with a hole in it so that you can then put a thread extender on the actual stud where the oil filter screws onto, as the oil filter still stays there if you don't actually move it with like a filter relocation system. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I personally never did that on my car. I'm fine with the filter where it is, but so you get a little main thread to extend it, and the sandwich plate does exactly what it is. It sandwiches between the filter and the engine, so that when oil begins to leave the engine, first thing it does is it goes through into the filter, loops around, goes out of the filter, and goes down the first set of lines that enter into the oil cooler. Once in the oil cooler, it will flow through the cooler, cool down, go back on the other side of the lines, and go back into the sandwich plate, and then back into the engine. So it's a very, very simple system. Like I said, it does add a little bit more complexity over OEM, especially if you don't have an oil cooler from factory. But overall, as long as you run the lines nicely, or especially if you buy a pre-built kit, a lot of people on Miatas have pre-built kits where they put the oil filter down by the power steering rack, they mount it down there. That gets a lot of airflow, that's super good, the lines are super short. Problem with that for me is I have a custom-built splitter for my car that covers that area where the oil cooler would go, so if I put it down there, it would get absolutely no air. So that's why I put mine in front of the radiator. It works just as well. It's completely up to you where you get it, as long as it gets good airflow. So yeah, that is what a sandwich plate is, and what, on my Miata personally, what my optimized oil cooler setup looks like. Now, another little thing that usually goes along with oil coolers is the lines. 99% of the time when you buy an oil cooler from a kit or anything, that's going to have what's called a AN line. That is these style braided lines that I have right here. These ones are personally cut as I shorten these lines because this is the extra that was on the ones I got from that FC RX-7. So AN lines are very, very simple lines. They're just usually a braided, whether it be metal braids or fabric braids, just to an actual fitting. That the nice part about AN lines is they don't require any kind of thread sealant tape like Teflon tape, anything like that. You don't need that with them. They're super, super simple, just easy lines to work with. Pretty easy to press fittings onto them. There are other types of lines too. There are rubber lines people like to use. There are some stainless steel braided lines that are a little bit different from AN lines, but most times when you get an oil cooler setup, they're going to have AN lines. And AN lines, it's usually going to be in sizes AN6 through AN12 or what I usually see. Mine are AN10 personally. The larger the AN number is, the bigger the actual diameter of the hoses. That can have, advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, the smaller the hoses, the more pressure that the system will keep. However, then the more restricted it will be, and then the bigger it is, the more oil will flow, but the lower the pressure. So, kind of want to find a good median there. That's why I went with AN10. It's big enough where it actually keeps flowing. Small enough where it flows oil nicely, but not too small where it constricts it, and not too big where it just kind of lets the oil barely move. And I don't get a lot of pressure drop. I think from having the oil cooler to not, I probably have only lost maybe like 5 to 10 psi of pressure. I'm not 100% sure. So anybody who might know that can leave a comment down below on how much usually things like a Miata would drop in pressure. I know a lot of it really depends on oil cooler size, lines, all that. But yeah, so just a little quick thing mostly about AN lines, as that's what I'm personally experienced with. Very easy to work with, just your usual standard line when it comes to oil coolers. Now, in the beginning of this video, I did mention something like transmission coolers or diff coolers, things like that. Those do fall under oil coolers, as there is oil, obviously, in your differentials or, your transmission, things like that. A lot of heavy-duty trucks, my Jeep Cherokee, that has a transmission cooler. That one's built into the radiator. Usually on larger trucks or things like that, people will run a transmission cooler or a diff cooler. As the larger the vehicle, the more weight it has to pull, the hotter that fluid's going to get, especially if it's an automatic transmission. So a lot of big trucks and things like that will come from factory with transmission coolers. Again, it's the same thing. It's just an oil cooler. It's just to cool down a different type of oil. The cooler doesn't really change in design depending on oil. They change a little bit, but almost every factory car you're ever going to see is going to have an air to oil cooler. It's very rare to see a water to oil cooler. I've never seen one on a factory car. I've never really even seen one on an aftermarket car. It's just even a little bit more complex than just an air to oil cooler. And most times the air to oil cooler is more than sufficient for cooling down the car. Quick little thing, it's not fully related to oil coolers, but I did want to bring this up. This is a status update on the Miata. This is for all my continuous viewers. Thank you very much for continuously watching my videos, guys. The Miata is basically done right now. I just have to go get an alignment done, which I'm getting done later on next week. It will be ready for the upcoming track days. I'm very sorry about there, not being much Miata actual content right now. I've been having issues with recordings and files or getting corrupted or missing an SD card, things like that. So I apologize. There will be more Miata content coming in the very near future. But it is basically done. I will show what it looks like currently at the end of this video after the little after credits scene for anyone who's wondering. But again, just wanted to give a quick little thing. So thank you so much for sticking with me, guys. I apologize that the Miata has been kind of a bit weird right now just because I've been bouncing around so much between it, the Volvo, and videos like this. But again, thank you so much for watching. So here she is. It's a little hard to see, but we have the whole new 5X Racing suspension in. The ride height right now is 5 inches in the front and 5 1/4 inches from the pinch welds to the ground. I thought that was just a little bit of an easier way to measure ride height. A lot of performance builds for track Miatas measure it that way, but as you can see, nice and new. Everything in the new suspension system. New manual steering rack right there. So the Miata is looking good. We are almost done with everything. Just have to fully reassemble everything in the front end, which is super simple on this car because everything is quick release. And like I said, go get it aligned, and then it's ready to hit the track. Alright guys, so again, I apologize, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter video. There's not a ton to talk about with oil coolers. Again, they're just kind of a niche thing that people overlook. So, thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm very sorry about no real Miata content for the past 2-3 weeks. I promise we're going to be having stuff coming. We're going to be doing track days very, very soon. I'm going to do a recap video on the full Miata Suspension 2.0. It's almost there. It's got to get it aligned, do a couple other little things, and then it'll be ready for the track. So I'm super excited about that. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching, guys. We're going to be doing a couple more Let's Talks in the near future. I'm looking at potentially doing one about short throw shifters, so that one's going to be exciting because there's a lot to cover about that. So thank you so much for watching, guys. See you in the next one. Peace.